Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about the new Zack Snyder film, Rebel Moon. It just dropped on Netflix. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So Zack Snyder's films are often quite buzzworthy and tend to spark very passionate opinions either for or against. And his latest film, Rebel Moon Part 1, seems like it's likely going to be no different in that regard. This story kind of famously started off as a failed pitch to Disney to make an R-rated Star Wars film before ultimately kind of finding its way onto Netflix as an original story and sort of the first entry in the start of what is intended to be like a new franchise, kind of epic space opera. And as someone who both loves the sci-fi genre as well as just original stories, original storytelling, I was very much rooting for this film, although I'm quite agnostic towards Zack Snyder as a filmmaker. I do think this is the type of film that Hollywood needs more of. But unfortunately, I think this is also the type of film that will keep Hollywood executives from signing off on more of these films, because it gives me no pleasure to say that this is just not a good film. Because kind of from start to finish, this movie is a mess. It's kind of this uncompelling exercise, I think, in just style over substance that has sort of unimpressive spectacle that's never able to kind of overcome a very hollow and kind of derivative story. Because while Rebel Moon is an original story in the sense that it's like not tied to any existing franchise or intellectual property, kind of this original story is very clearly inspired by and derivative of several other very well-known stories like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and like Seven Samurai. And I typically have a higher tolerance for like imitative storytelling than a lot of people do. I think kind of classic story elements should be repackaged. They should be retold. But the problem with kind of the way that Rebel Moon approaches it is not really that it's just plucking elements that you know from other stories. It's just that kind of while the story kind of takes like the outward body of those familiar stories, it's never able to kind of capture the soul of what made those other stories kind of so compelling. And kind of as a result, this film almost becomes like a greatest hits album, kind of featuring all the familiar songs by, the great legendary rock and roll bands throughout history, but each one performed by a cover band, because all stuff you've seen before. It just doesn't sound as good as what you've heard previously. For example, there's like a scene that takes place in a tavern in this film, which is very explicit kind of homage to the famous cantina scene in Star Wars, and yet it lacks that same kind of sense of like wonder and like unworldliness, and even like it very much follows like the familiar story beat of like Seven Samurai, of like we're putting together a team to protect these innocent villagers from the oppressive bad guys. But like the team itself that is assembled is this forgettable, and it just lacks like the banter and like this the character dynamics of the group that make some of those other movies just a lot more compelling and interesting. And the film really just doesn't do much at all to give audiences a reason to feel any kind of emotional attachment or investment in these characters, because they are so sort of paper thin and underdeveloped. And Sofia Boutella is the lead character in this role, a character called Cora, and she is fine. Like she's definitely able to handle like the kind of the no nonsense, like the physicality of her character. Kind of unfortunately though is that her character really has nothing going on beyond sort of that physical, like the action elements. She's way too kind of self-serious and like guarded of a character to make it easy for audiences to grasp onto her. I think for her character to work, you kind of need to surround her by a bunch of other characters that are a bit more like dynamic and a bit more sympathetic. And kind of despite what is a very stellar cast, a lot of faces and names that you recognize pop up in this film, none of them end up making much more of an impression. And I think the fault really is more on the script rather than it is like the performances of these actors, because a lot of this movie is sort of almost this episodic journey as sort of the main characters like travel around to these different planets and like recruit members of their team, kind of hired guns, in order to take them back to defend this village. But kind of after each one of these sort of introductions of the new team, whether that's like a kind of a conversation or like a big action kind of set piece, like once they're on the team itself, they're kind of abandoned. They're relegated just to the fringe of the story and kind of just passively like lurk, and they just sort of follow the characters around, but they have no interaction like with each other. And like some of the characters like they speak kind of as they're introduced, and then they don't have another line until like 30 minutes or more later in this film, like at the very end. And this film introduces these characters seemingly because it needs a band of heroes in this story, but really has nothing for them to do. And they just sort of passively kind of silently wait until the film needs to kind of call back upon them, whenever there's like an action set pieces, but really have nothing to like their characters as people themselves. And Zack Snyder, he's never been known for, his character development or even like his complex storytelling. I think the reason he keeps kind of getting the keys to these big blockbuster films is that he does have a very distinctive sort of filmmaking approach and very kind of stylized visuals and actions. And I do think that some of the opinions on sort of that element of his filmmaking is subjective. Some people love it. Some people don't. But at least for me, Rebel Moon very much is Zack Snyder giving in to sort of all of his worst tendencies and then taking those tendencies way too far to the extreme. Because the visuals and stuff, at times they are striking. You sort of have like the big planets in the background, and some of the locations are visually interesting, but they never feel very immersive because of an over-reliance on just like clearly green screens that these actors are performing on, and just sort of unconvincing CGI. And you can't talk about a Zack Snyder movie without talking about slow motion. And there is so much slow motion in this film. Like every scene almost has slow motion. The action obviously has a bunch of it, but even just like characters walking out of a spaceship onto a new planet, for some reason is sort of giving the slow motion treatment, kind of real dramatic. And I'm not against necessarily using slow motion in action, but it's used so much in these action scenes to the point that like almost the whole action scene seems to take place in slow motion, that rather than kind of adding like an exciting flair to the action, it just sort of strips these scenes of any kind of energy. Because I was watching this movie with my wife, kind of in the middle of like one of these climactic epic battle scenes. She leaned over and said, "Hey, this is the slowest battle scene I have ever seen in my life." And because that technique is used so much, it just ends up overstaying its welcome, kind of losing the impact that it could have had in more like restrained doses. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, there is some stuff, but maybe not as much as you might be expecting. I do think there are plans to release like an R-rated version of this movie. The original one that dropped on Netflix, this is PG-13. So as far as like language, there's no F words as far as I heard, although there are sort of various other minor, scattered profanities all throughout this, and at least one kind of utterance of God, and kind of one vulgar slaying of bullocks. Violence, there's a lot of action in this movie that offer quite high death counts, but very little, almost a surprisingly little amount of any kind of blood or like gratuitously depicted violence. Because soldiers, a bunch of them are blasted with laser guns like in the chest or in the head, or there's characters that get hit with like blunt kind of like clubs or sort of lightsaber-esque swords. So there is a lot of violence, but nothing overly gratuitous. I think a lot of that is probably being saved for the R-rated version. Sexuality, there's some stuff here, although not a whole lot that is depicted just, in screen. The leader of sort of the village in this movie does indicate that like sex is a form of worship to the kind of the gods of the harvest, and he kind of talks about how they're going to be thrusting their hips tonight and kind of celebrating, although you don't actually see those acts of worship. Another man indicates that he likes his woman young, and there's a scene where a group of sort of evil soldiers are attempting to rape this kind of younger teenage or young adult girl, and they sort of make their vulgar intentions very clear, although they're interrupted and she's rescued before they can act on those intentions. Also, like in that kind of Star Wars inspired cantina scene, there are a bunch of like male prostitutes, both human and then alien, and one of the aliens of those does grab a man by the crotch and kind of attempt to entice him to come up to bed with him, although the character refuses. In another scene, a man is shown kind of reclining naked, although there's some strategically placed objects that cover the important bits. And kind of in that same scene, the character is sort of like embraced by these tentacles from some unseen kind of alien creature. And kind of the implication is that it's probably some kind of sexual relationship thing going on, although that's never made explicit in the film itself. And kind of that same character later in this movie is once again naked, although in a non kind of sexual way, kind of laying on his side. But again, none of the important bits are visible on screen. Maybe one other content thing is there is sort of some religious, kind of ambiguous spiritual things that are going on. Again, like the character refers to like the gods of the harvest, and then later another character refers to God in like a singular way. And there's also sort of an unexplained story element, kind of featuring like a messiah like figure and a prophecy that I think is mostly going to be left for the next film to unpack. So there are some sort of religious elements, although most of them kind of are kept to the fringe of the story. In many ways, Rebel Moon kind of reflects the various themes from the movies that inspired it. Just the nature of power and kind of freedom and fighting for injustice, and kind of the central, I guess, tension for the characters in this story is this sort of they're confronted with how do you sort of find hope and kind of find virtue in a world that seems to be kind of corrupted and void of it? Do you cling to kind of what's right and what's good, or do you just sort of seek your own sort of survival by embracing like the prevailing mindsets of the world? And you kind of see the characters in the story taking both of those diverging paths. Because in some ways, this film is kind of this theme is very loosely but analogous to sort of a Christian worldview, because in several flashbacks, there's this sort of royal princess who is sort of that messiah like figure that was sort of prophesied to save the world. And she is depicted as very sort of pure, very innocent, just a very good character, sort of in a very dark world. And kind of when that character, in the past dies a very untimely death, it sends a lot of these characters sort of reeling, kind of questioning their beliefs. And Cora, like the main character in this film, witnessed sort of that princess's sort of the goodness firsthand, and admits to another character that she was a believer, kind of in what this character represented. But now, years later, in the time that the story takes place, she has lost hope, and she is sort of seeking her own selfish survival rather than kind of the well-being or the good of the people around her. But ultimately, kind of through her journey, she does realize that she can set kind of an example that she saw in the princess, and kind of allow some of those qualities like of virtue and goodness and charity to shine through in her own life and kind of be a catalyst to inspire others. And it remains to be seen kind of how that theme continues to be unpacked in part 2 of this. And obviously in many other ways, this film is inconsistent with like a biblical worldview. But I think as long as like the analogy isn't stretched too far and trying to turn into some kind of Christian allegory, I do think these themes can be good ones for Christians. And this is the question of how do we respond to a broken world? Do we kind of lose faith in sort of divine providence? Do we cling to what is good, or do we kind of embrace sort of the evil of the world? So I don't think this film necessarily goes super deep into any of that, but there are I think some worthwhile themes in there. So in the end, this very much feels like part 1 of a bigger story. Zack Snyder is clearly trying to kind of lay the groundwork for this big epic story. And even after a 2-hour runtime, it really feels like this story is just getting started, that the whole thing has just been spent trying to get all the characters together and set the pieces. And it does end on a very kind of unsatisfying, incomplete notion. Audiences won't have to wait long. Part 2 of this does release in April, but I think, at least for me, the question will be if anyone even remembers this film or feels any kind of investment in the first one by the time that second film arrives. But hey, I'd love to hear what you guys think about this film, whether you enjoyed it a lot more than I did, or whether you felt similar to me that this film, despite good intentions, despite, the admirable kind of original story, it just doesn't work. The pieces never come together to leave any kind of lasting impression. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about that. And if you haven't done so, I encourage you guys to subscribe to our channel, become a Collider, get lots of movie reviews and live streams and other things. We'd love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through World for Christ.